Ben, some people in the audience are probably saying, wait a second. I saw the video for myself. His knee was on the neck for 9 minutes. It's tattooed in my memory. You guys, Charlie and Ben, are getting too cutesy here with, trying to introduce data that isn't relevant. Don't lie to me. This is what happened. It was obviously police brutality. It wasn't some sort of legal conspiracy. Ben, what would your response be to that? And also, when did you start to form the opinion that this was a railroaded via the justice system against Derek Chauvin?
So when I started to change my opinion on it, again, you can find tweets from me in May when this first broke talking about police brutality, was watching the actual trial. So when I watched the actual trial, when I read the medical examiner's report, when I was watching the defense witnesses and the prosecution witnesses, by the way, when I was watching all that go down, it occurred to me, they do not have the evidence to convict this man beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, there's just not that's just not the case. And then when after the trial, further evidence came out about the predilections of the jurors. So, for example, one of the jurors was photographed at a protest commemorating the Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech during the summer of 2020. This is Coleman Hughes reporting for the Free Press. At that protest, 2 of George Floyd's family members addressed the crowd, and this juror was wearing a T-shirt with a picture of King and the words, "Get your knee off our necks" in BLM. How is that a fair trial? In what world is that even remotely a fair trial? I think that the image of Chauvin on top of Floyd became such an iconic image that it's very difficult for people to imagine that anything else happened. But there was tape both before and after the incident. There's medical examiners' reports. There's medical information about George Floyd and his prior status, and all of that makes an enormous difference. Now, the imagistic power of Chauvin in the suppression position with Floyd obviously is going to have an outsized power in the public memory, but that's exactly why I think it's really important for people to speak out, and I think for the pardon to occur, because in order for there to be a rethinking of things like this, it is important to get people to even re-examine the issue. There's so many things people think that they saw that they never actually saw over the course of the last 10 years. I mean, so many different things. I recall the supposed Charlottesville speech by President Trump, in which he supposedly said that neo-Nazis were very fine people. And then if you go back and actually watch the speech, he never said anything remotely like that. But that was emblazoned in people's memories because it was hit so hard and so often that many people still think that is in fact true, and that is in fact the case. There's still people on the left, many people, who still believe that hands up, don't shoot in the case of Michael Brown and Ferguson was true, that he held up his hands and then was shot to death by a police officer. And so the reality is that the way that memory works is if people show you an image over and over and over and over, that's the only thing in your memory about the particular case. I'm not denying that the image is visually ugly. I'm not denying that the tape doesn't, quote unquote, look good. What I am saying is that if you've ever done a police ride-along or if you know police officers, guess what? Policing is a rough and difficult job that people who are rough and difficult it's a tough thing to do. Policing is very, very difficult. You're in the worst situations with people at the worst moments of their lives. And what that means is none of it looks good on tape. I mean, honestly, do a ride-along with a cop for one night and you will see a bunch of things that would not look good on tape. Why? Because you're dealing with people who may be violent with police officers, who may be a threat, who may be high on drugs, who may not know what they're doing. And so simply taking an image out of context and then saying, because this image is ugly and because it exists, I'm going to ignore all other evidence. That is not the way certainly our justice system is supposed to work. And that's the real key. You don't have to believe that Derek Chauvin is quote unquote innocent in order to understand that he is not guilty. Those are not the same thing. The standard of justice in the United States is that you have to be proved guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And Derek Chauvin in the public mind was not just convicted of second-degree murder. He was convicted in the public mind of first-degree murder, and he was also convicted of brutal American racism. Again, I come back to this point. These things were not alleged. And just as I think that it is very important that President Trump, for example, pardoned pro-lifers, because the image in the public mind that has been created by the legacy media for decades on end is that pro-lifers are violently protesting outside abortion clinics, and therefore they have to be arrested. That's not true. And so I think the pardon is important. Or the reason I think that it was important for President Trump, even if I disagree with him on some of the pardons on January 6th, to pardon nonviolent people on January 6th is because it is important to re-examine narratives if the narratives are overdrawn. And again, you don't have to agree with me on every aspect of this case to understand that Derek Chauvin did not receive a free trial and that the major railroading that went on here was not just a railroading of Derek Chauvin. It was a railroading of our police broad writ, as you mentioned, and it was also a railroading of America in general, because this turned into the launching point for a years-long effort to characterize America as deeply and irredeemably racist.
Ben, just mentioned briefly here, the autopsy was totally coerced, strong-armed. Usually we look at autopsies, say, well, there's no way politics could get in the way of a medical examination report. But it shows here that there was such a thrust, there was a willingness, to reach a conclusion that America's racist during this political season. Remember, Trump was president during this. There was political pressure. Speak about the political pressure in the medical examination process.
Well, I mean, we know for a fact that there are people who are involved in this case, medical examiners and others, who are actually the subject of death threats. If you became a public figure in the Derek Chauvin case, the chances that you were going to be subjected to public pressure were incredibly high. There was only one major autopsy that was a complete documented autopsy of George Floyd, and it was performed, as you say, by the Hennepin County medical examiner, a guy named Dr. Andrew Baker. It was performed about 12 hours after he died. And that autopsy found zero evidence of asphyxia. It found no life-threatening injuries. It found instead that Floyd died of cardiopulmonary arrest, meaning his heart and his lungs stopped working during, quote, law enforcement subdual restraints and neck compression. Also, he had a potentially lethal dose of fentanyl in his blood, 11 milligrams per milliliter, along with a small amount of meth, as well as morphine. He also had arterial sclerotic heart disease, described as multifocal, severe hypertensive heart disease, and cardiomegaly, which is an enlarged heart. Okay, the second autopsy that was created was paid for by Floyd's family. It was incomplete. They didn't have access to Floyd's toxicology report. They didn't have access to his tissue samples. They didn't have access to his organs, at least some of his organs. And one of the two medical examiners who's brought in, Dr. Michael Baden, who's brought in to suggest that it was the cops who actually killed him, he'd gotten an enormous number of things wrong in the past. He was a person who was hired to perform an unofficial autopsy on Michael Brown, who we mentioned earlier. Michael Brown, of course, was the black man who was killed in a confrontation with police officer named Officer Brown over in Ferguson, Missouri. And the autopsy in that particular case, Baden declared that there was no evidence of a struggle between Brown and Wilson, which was not true, because the cop had claimed correctly that Michael Brown reached into the car and fired a gun in the car, which is what prompted the actual shooting of Michael Brown. And Baden got it wrong in that autopsy. He was the person who they called in. So you have the original autopsy, which says no asphyxia, no actual physical evidence of serious damage, and he died of cardiopulmonary arrest, which, again, if you're just doing a basic analysis of, are you going to get excited when this is really one of the questions. Are you going to get excited when you get arrested and you have drugs on you and then you swallow some of the drugs? My guess is you probably will. Right? This causes very often what they call excited delirium. If it spikes your blood pressure, if it spikes your heart rate, if you have massive pre-existing conditions, if you're a big dude with a lot of drugs in your system, and you're claiming you can't breathe before you even get on the ground, then how can you claim that it was the knee that caused the I can't breathe, as opposed to all of the other circumstances that were causing all of this?
And again, just to put this in the most blunt terms, Chauvin did not crush Floyd's neck. He did not crush Floyd's neck.